Today on Uncommon Knowledge, a tale of two colors, blue and red.
Funding for this program is provided by the John M. Olin Foundation and the STARR Foundation.
Welcome to Uncommon Knowledge. I'm Peter Robinson. On our show today, the future of the Grand Old Party. Here we have a map showing the results of the 2000 presidential election. The Republican candidate, George W. Bush, carried the counties shown in red, which looks pretty good. There are, after all, far more red counties than blue counties. However, as you'll recall, the electoral vote between the Republican candidate Bush and the Democratic candidate Gore was nearly equal, and Gore actually won a majority in the popular vote. What that means is that although there are fewer blue counties, they contain more people. Moreover, George W. Bush's base of support was largely white and Protestant. Those are two categories that are shrinking as a proportion of the overall population, suggesting coming trouble for the GOP. So, what is the future of the Republican Party? And in particular, can the GOP ever hope to appeal to traditionally Democratic constituencies, such as African Americans, Hispanics, or Catholics? Joining us today, two guests. Nelson Polsby is a professor of political science at the University of California at Berkeley, and Newt Gingrich, a business consultant, is former Speaker of the House of Representatives. Last election, the Republican Party achieves almost exact parity at the national level with the Democratic Party. Half the seats in the Senate, sliver-thin majority in the House, a president in the White House who loses the popular vote, although he wins in the Electoral College. Is there any realistic prospect that within the next few elections, the GOP can break out of parity and achieve dominance? Newt.
As good a prospect as there is for the Democrats.
Nelson?
Yeah, that's probably right. That's probably right.
Okay. Political consultant John Morgan is fond of saying that the difference between the Republican Party and the Democratic Party is largely the difference between Plymouth Rock and Ellis Island. The problem? Plymouth Rock Americans are shrinking as a proportion of the population. George Bush in the last campaign made a concerted effort to reach out to three groups of non-Plymouth Rock Americans: African Americans, Hispanics, Catholics. Let's take them one at a time. African Americans. Bob Dole wins 12% in 1996. George W. Bush campaigns, again making a concerted effort to appeal to African Americans, and wins 8% of the vote. Newt, how come?
Well, I don't think Republicans are going to break through with African Americans until they realize it is a 365-day-a-year project, that you have to be in the community, that you have to dispute people like Julian Bond when they say you're a racist, that you have to have the nerve to be on black radio, to be on black television, and to be communicating in a direct way. I mean, today the message most African Americans get unrelentingly from the NAACP, from Jesse Jackson, from a whole range of people, is that you have a frightening, racist, dangerous Republican Party that is eager to eliminate your right to vote, return you to slavery. I mean, Al Gore goes to a church just before the election and says that Bush is going to appoint people who think that blacks are 3/5 of a person. That's his interpretation of a constitutional judge. And I think the Republican Party doesn't have a clue today how desperately it is important to be contesting that kind of language and contesting that kind of imagery on an everyday basis all year around if you're ever going to have any chance of breaking through.
Nelson, I mentioned that George W. Bush got 4% less of the African American vote than did Bob Dole.
Well, he got...
It's about 30% less, excuse me. Four points fewer.
That's
4
right.
points fewer. But he also got 9 points fewer than Ronald Reagan in 1984 and 6 points fewer than Barry Goldwater in 1964. Why did George W. Bush drop? What's going on? Increased hostility? Why?
I can't explain that. I think, by the way, carving up the electorate in this fashion isn't the Republican strategy. That is, the way Republicans win presidential elections is by doing slightly better than usual with the big middle.
The big middle, how do
The
you,
big- in other-
is defined
in
how?
other words, by dividing up the electorate into the mosaic, you're positing that both major parties are constructed the same way, but they're not. The Democrats are the mosaic. The Republicans are the party of the big middle. And their proper strategy, in my opinion, if they want to win presidential elections, is to do slightly better than usual. That's all it takes. With middle class, middling income, middle educated, middle everything.
Let me build on that
Sure.
for 1 second, because Nelson's right. There's a new book out by Michael Barone called The New Americans,
Right.
which is a fabulous book about how America assimilates, and basically compares Irish in the 19th century with African Americans today, Italians in the 19th century with Hispanics today, and Jews in the 19th century with Asians today. I mean, really, it makes a lot of sense out of it. Back to Ellis Island for a second. The truth is, Republicans do very well now with the Irish. And
Right.
the Republicans are beginning to do very well with the Italians. They're beginning to break through with Polish Americans. That's really the Ellis Island crew, except for Jews, where for a variety of reasons, largely ideological, the Republicans have been closed out. The Jewish American vote is the second most Democratic vote after the African American vote. But I'm inclined to agree largely with Nelson with one caveat. I think that a Republican Party, a Bush administration, if they do okay with the economy, if they can communicate personal Social Security savings accounts to the young in a way that the young decide it is a substantial advantage, so that you have a breakthrough across all young people, not just targeting ethnicity. And then second, I do think the one place the Republicans have to focus very dramatically is among Hispanic Americans. If Republicans can carry Hispanic Americans and keep their normal base, they are the majority party of the next generation.
Okay, so do the Republicans need to make a special effort to reach out to minority voters, specifically African and Hispanic Americans, or not? The Republican Party, like all organizations, has limited resources, and to devote resources to one endeavor is to take them away from other endeavors. So you would agree then that the Republican Party should just give up on African Americans?
Look,
I'm overstating the case to be
look,
provocative, but
yeah, look, I wanted to complete one sentence that you began.
Go right ahead.
You said Plymouth Rock is shrinking.
as a proportion of the population.
Yes,
right.
well, the other half of it is Ellis Island is closed.
Well-
And that is, of course, Newt made the point that if you start poking around in these Ellis Island populations, you discover there's a fair number of Republicans in them. It seems to me the Republican way of thinking about this ought to be, how do we capitalize on the fact that more and more Americans are in the big middle?
Listen to this.
That's the problem. Now, as for Hispanics, very difficult problem. Here's why. Hispanics actually in the United States come in a number of different flavors. And for example, you can see figures which show you that well-to-do Hispanics, in fact, tend to be Republican. They're Cubans.
That's right.
They're Cubans.
They come in
And-
a lot of flavors, but there's only one that votes Republican.
That's
the
right.
Cubans vote Republican.
And not all Cubans.
Punto.
It's the Miami Cubans. The Tampa Cubans are Democrats. So it's time to stop talking about Hispanics and start talking about Puerto Ricans, Chicanos, Texas version, different from California version.
Why is the Texas? Look, I'm willing to say, of course, there are lots of different flavors, as you put it, but a lot of them come from Mexico. You have
That's right.
a band all from southern Texas, southern Arizona, and throughout California, up into the Central Valley.
Different parts of Mexico. You may
Yeah,
want to
well,
Go ahead.
yes. I mean, one of the things that happens to be true of that population, which, by the way, Mike Barone got right,
He compares Hispanics to
Italians.
Italians, meaning strong
Well,
emphasis on family,
well, that's
manual labor.
No, but here's the real thing. A fair number of them came over with the intention of going back.
I see.
They were here for economic reasons. Now, okay, so Hispanic population, lots of different flavors, requires lots of different strategies. The great master Republican strategy, in my opinion, ought to be, judging just simply on the way they've won in the past, is scoop them up when they get into the middle class. That's the way you do it. You're going to get...
Throughout the 1980s and the 1990s,
All right.
Hispanics in California cast between 30 and 40% of their votes for Republicans in statewide races. 1994, Proposition 187 is on the ballot in California. It's passed. It's never actually put into effect. It's tied up in court. But the proposition would have denied state services to illegal immigrants, including schooling. In that year, the Hispanic vote for Republicans, the Republican at the head of the ticket was Pete Wilson, who supported Prop 187, collapses. It falls to a little below 20%, and it hasn't recovered yet. Did the GOP, by supporting 187, position itself as the anti-immigrant party? And is it going to be stuck with a stigma? Or are there special circumstances that explain that?
Cannot predict the future. But
Nelson,
if you had asked me, was that a smart thing to do, I would have said no, it wasn't a smart thing.
Newt?
Well, I think clearly in California, for the short run, it hurt Republicans with Hispanics. On the other hand, Bush got about half the Hispanic vote in Texas running for re-election.
For re-election as governor.
As governor. Yeah. He got a very significant percentage, though, across everywhere. And talking about Mexican Americans now.
Right.
He did very well with Mexican Americans everywhere but California. California draws him down to about 35% of the vote nationally. And I would just suggest that Bush, both by his own ability to speak Spanish, by his natural inclination, by his friendship with Vicente Fox, Bush, in fact, represents a much more inclusive Republican attitude. He also represents a more inclusive Republican attitude towards African Americans. The difference is you've had 20 years of Democratic politicians and left-wing activists in the black community creating a monolithic sense of a siege mentality, that if we don't all stick together, crosses will be burned, churches will be bombed, people will be in trouble. I think the Republican Party has a moral obligation to take that on, not as a question of resources, but as a question of simply saying you can't have a healthy country in which 16-year-old blacks grow up learning only vicious, negative, dishonest things and believing them to be true because they never hear an alternative message. They never hear a conflicting message. So from that standpoint, I think Bush has to go for a strategy to get 20% of the African American vote rather than 8%, but a strategy ultimately to get 50 to 60% of the Hispanic vote. And I think that Bush has a real opportunity to be identified in a way that transcends economics. I agree with Nelson. It's easier for us to get middle-class votes, but you also see patterns where, because of social bonding, people will vote out of their class. In the South, the great swing to the Republican Party after 1964 had fully as many poor whites as wealthy whites making the swing, because, in fact, their hostility to the federal government and their opposition to forced integration moved many poor whites. Middle-class and upper-middle-class whites in the South had been moving for a generation to the Republican Party, but the real breakthrough comes when as a cultural phenomenon, the white South just moves to the Republican Party from 1964 to 1980.
Okay, now look, the idea that these things turn on occasional breakthroughs seems to me right. And that, of course, tells you something about the power of that California proposition to shape attitudes for a long time.
Let's take a closer look at the relationship between Hispanics and the Republican Party in the nation's most populous state, California. Let's talk about California then. We have the largest state in the union by a considerable margin. A little over 1/10 of the population lives here. The Republican Party, right up through the governorship of Pete Wilson, is in recent decades never able to dominate Sacramento. But it is able to get enough people in the Senate and enough people in the Assembly, and it's able to get governors, and it does so largely by, you've got Los Angeles tends to be Democratic, it has for some decades now, but from Orange County South is Republican, the Central Valley was Republican, but now something has happened. The Central Valley is now almost as Hispanic as white. Fresno County is about even. So the huge influx, the Central Valley, which used to be reliably Republican, is now on a knife edge. The point I'm trying to get at is this. If the Republican Party can appeal to Hispanics in this state, does it put the state back into play?
Overnight.
Overnight.
Mathematically, that's
that is to say, it's that one element.
Well, look, Mayor Reardon, I think, is the most likely Republican to win statewide, simply from the fact that he is the Republican who will get the largest percentage of the Hispanic community. He's been the most effective in Los Angeles getting Hispanic votes. He's simpatico, he has a sense of common ground, and I think that changes the equation almost overnight. It's still a Democratic-leaning state, but a Republican who can effectively appeal to the Hispanic community. Abel Maldonado, who's a young assemblyman on the coast, who is first generation. His parents came from Mexico. He is a Republican assemblyman who's right on the environment for the coast, who's right on business and fiscal policies, who could campaign in the Hispanic community. He's the kind of guy who represents the future of the Republican
Now
Party.
we've got a case in which we say, look, California is crucial to put the state back into play. You appeal to one group, Hispanics, and you've done it. But Nelson was just saying, wait a minute, this is the wrong way to go about it. Republicans should not be trying to play the politics of group identity. So the question is, how do you adopt Nelson's rule in which you enunciate the broad principles of the Republican Party and hope that people in the middle...
I don't agree with Nelson's rule.
Oh, well, then tell us where Nelson's wrong.
That's not what the rule was.
Oh, Nelson, you don't mind my being a little provocative. Go ahead, restate it.
Okay, all right. The rule is simply this. Republicans tend to win the presidency when they do better with the big middle. Every political party has to also concern itself with the mosaic, but that's not the Republican strength. The point is, the way Democrats win is by putting together this mosaic of predominantly underdog or formerly underdog groups.
They stitch together coalitions.
that's-
We appeal to the middle.
That's right. That's the way, and the two political parties are in fact differently constituted. That is, they're different animals.
This is an asymmetry. It's not yin and yang. They're
That-
not mirror
No,
images of
that's
each other
exactly-
at all.
that is exactly
That's the
right.
point I'm trying to make.
Okay.
I'm not trying to make the point that Republicans shouldn't try to cut into the groups that are extremely loyal to
Go
the
ahead, Newt.
Democrats. Of course, they have to.
But I think what's fascinating about the Republican predicament is that the Republican Party of the 1940s and 50s had to absorb a group of people that made it very uncomfortable. White Southern Protestants who were much more fundamentalist, much less mainstream. And there was a long period of tension as the party absorbed that. I would
They
argue,
would stand out. If somebody, a Republican from Alabama would stand out at lunchtime at the
there
Round Hill Club in
there
Greenwich.
there was real tension between
Right.
what you were describing earlier as sort of the New England tradition
Right.
and this really Scots Highlands, Scots-Irish tradition. I think the party is faced now with the same challenge again. That is, the new emerging comfortable Republican National Party, and I agree with Nelson, we are not the manager of coalitions, the Democrats are. The Democrats get people who are very uncomfortable with each other into a room for the purpose of acquiring power, divide up the power and get back out of the room before they have to get to know each other very well. Republicans really do grow by aggregating. We are now going to have to aggregate Hispanics who will make many traditional Republicans uncomfortable, and traditional Republicans will make Hispanics uncomfortable, but it is inevitable mathematically, if the Republican Party is going to be a success, that it find a way.
We've talked about African Americans and Hispanics. Let's turn to the third minority to whom the Republicans have tried to reach out, Catholics.
Bush, in the last election, loses, not badly, but he loses the overall Catholic vote. But among Catholics who attend church every week, religiously active Catholics, he gets about 57% of the vote, the same amount that Ronald Reagan got. Now, 84% of white evangelicals, Protestants, religiously active Protestants vote for Bush, but only 57% of religiously active Catholics vote for Bush. And according to certain GOP strategists, the remaining 43% of religiously active Catholics is about 4 million voters, conveniently located in several swing states that Bush lost narrowly, represent a very large pool of
grabs.
available voters who
for
are up
grabs.
for grabs.
Sure.
And so what the GOP should try to do is activate and bring into the party religiously active Catholics at the same levels that it already has white
yes,
Protestants.
sure.
So it becomes the party of believers.
Very, very, very sound analysis. I've read it myself. Now the question is, there are a couple of questions. First, is it not the case that religiously observant Catholics are shrinking just the way the Plymouth Rock bunch are? Maybe. Even so,
Okay.
This bunch is up for grabs. All right. Second, Newt has just actually laid out the problem. That will create some wedge issues. The moral equivalent, if you like, of gays in the military for Clinton, for Bush, is stem cell research. Broker that one among this bunch.
let me start-
Not so easy.
No.
Right. Let me start by pointing out that probably 2 million of those 4 million observant Catholics who didn't vote for Bush are
Right.
Hispanic. You're talking about the
Right,
same
sure, we're
people.
talking about the
Okay.
certain
people.
people.
So the truth is, if he expands his reach in the Hispanic community,
He's
he
getting
probably
half of the
picks
way
up-
there with the
He probably
Catholics.
picks up
He
half
gets
the people
80% of the Mormons too, but he's already won Idaho and Utah.
Right, exactly.
Right.
He gets them without trying to.
Well, but all right, but it's true. Religiously observant people are,
Does that concern you, by the way? Gore, about 40% of the electorate doesn't go to church or synagogue. Gore wins a majority of those. 40% consider themselves religiously active, and Bush wins a majority of those. Does it concern you that the Democratic and Republican parties
Are different? No.
are dividing along the lines of the party of unbelievers and the party of believers?
no.
No?
No, it seems to me perfectly sensible that there should be differences among the political
Doesn't bother
parties.
you.
And it's a genuine difference. I see legitimacy in there being two strong parties in a two-party system.
And it's actually a little bit of the European model. I mean, if you think of the Democratic Party as being parallel to the left-wing parties in Europe, the European tradition for 100 years has been to have a vaguely religiously oriented conservative party, the Christian Democratic Union, Christian Socialist in Germany, for example, and to have a relatively unbelieving, secularizing party on the left. And in that sense, our politics are now fairly close to the European tradition.
And the only
But you're not
question,
thrilled about that,
no,
are you?
the only question one must pose to Newt is whether you really think Bush is the equivalent of Adenauer.
Well, one can always hope.
Okay, Newt, the religiously observant Catholics, whether Hispanic or not, tend to be pro-life.
Right.
They tend to oppose the death penalty, whereas the evangelicals down in the South tend to favor the death penalty. You've got a fissure that would run through the
There's
Republic.
another one. Educated Republican women.
70% in California of Republican women are pro-choice. How do you attempt to put together a party with that deep a fissure running through it?
Well,
No,
no.
I mean, first of all,
you already raised
managing.
the issue. I mean, it's not.
No,
as-
I know. I'm
not
just
as-
trying
not
to-
as-
I'm trying
it's
to
not as
square
though
it
we're
up.
putting it under the rug. That's the problem.
Look,
Right.
managing a majority in a country this size is always a function of finding the things that bring your side together and split up the other side. And it's always, I mean, go back and study the best person at doing this in American history, Franklin Delano Roosevelt. I mean, you always try to figure out how do you have Mississippi segregationist and black congressmen from Chicago in the same party at the same time while you're negotiating an anti-lynching law at the federal level, which was abhorrent to Mississippians who rejected the idea that the federal government should stop them from lynching people. But was really important to, actually more important to white liberals, and then to the black community. So start with that notion. You're always managing a coalition. You're always trying to find a way
Nothing new here.
to
Oh,
put
no,
things
how-
together.
but how do you do
not,
it?
Not quite. It is somewhat new for Republicans. That is to say, doing that trick is what Democrats have been accustomed to doing.
Precisely because the Republican Party was so overwhelmingly white and
The
Protestant.
Republic-
it shared-
Majority.
The Republicans did it differently, and when they won with national heroes. They were not into distributive politics so much as into
Okay.
principled
There's
politics.
a deep reason. Since
Yeah.
since I lived in that party, it was a minority party. Minority parties don't have to manage majorities by definition. The second you become a majority, you have a larger group of people in the room, you have greater differences in the room, and by the way, they all want something because they now think you're the majority. When you're the minority, they mostly want you to stop the majority. And that makes them fairly happy, so you can be a pretty negative party. But as a potential, and I think both parties right now are nascent majorities. Neither party has a stable path to a majority yet. So the Republican...
Last topic, a final look at the structural differences between the Republican and Democratic parties. Comment by George Gilder. Quote, Democrats essentially buy their way into office by putting together coalitions of fiercely engaged interest groups who could not survive without government subsidies. Republicans who try to beat the Democrats on their own turf of interest group politics are doomed. Republicans have to win by being leaders. That's very much what we were saying. Okay, here was Ronald Reagan's message.
Completely pejorative. Who's buying what? Tell me about the tax cut.
All right.
You know.
Let me give you
You're allowed to
Yeah.
you're allowed to
I'm-
whinge
but
and whine
I'm
about
with
this.
you.
Well,
I'm with
yeah,
Nelson.
I think I will whinge and whine about that one because it's
I thought I could get that
silly.
past you.
Yeah, I agree with him. I think it is a total misrepresentation of American politics.
You do.
Absolutely.
Okay.
I mean, both parties have to manage interests. I mean, it's defined in the Federalist Papers.
That's what you're
It's
supposed
at the
to do.
core of the system. It's how Jefferson and Hamilton got together on the national debt and the national capital. The fact is, Republicans, the minute we became a majority, we had interests who represented sugar. We had interests who represented peanuts. Now, these are things where, by any general economic theory,
That is interest group politics.
that's interest group politics.
How about oil?
It's television, so we have
Which
to
is,
wrap
by the
it
way,
up.
not an exclusive Republican franchise.
Democrats in Louisiana
Oil,
are
oil,
interested in
oil
oil.
Democrat. Sam Rayburn
Hold on.
was an oil Democrat.
Okay, look, it's television. I have to kind of wrap this up.
Yeah.
I'm going to ask you both for a prediction, and you remember you're a political scientist, and science isn't science unless it has some predictive value. Nelson doesn't like predictions.
that's nonsense.
Well, listen. For 4 months, from January until Jeffords switched parties and gave the Senate back to the Democrats, for 4 months, the Republican Party held the House and the Senate and the White House for the first time since the 1950s. How long will it be before that happens again? Nelson?
Have no idea. They managed it unwisely, by the way, while they had it.
Newt?
I think it'll probably take them 4 to 6 years to get the Senate back, but I think they'll keep the House.
But they'll keep that House?
Yes.
Newt Gingrich, Nelson Polsby, thank you very much.
Newt Gingrich and Nelson Polsby agreed. The GOP faces a difficult challenge in attempting to attract minority voters, but neither one was willing to make a prediction that the GOP would succeed or fail. There is, after all, no map to the future. I'm Peter Robinson. Thanks for joining us.